Power without patience breeds animals with crowns. Fear without reason builds yards for them. Obsession feeds both until they cannot tell the roots from the fruit. Better, perhaps, to learn from the boars, to know which roots to leave, when to walk away from something sweet and wrong, and how to listen for the law that hums beneath the floor we built over an old king's bones. Summer of 1483, in the Isenwald, the iron forest that stitches the border between the duchy of Hohenhart and the free towns of the Rhine. There, perched on a basalt promontory, stood Castle Tiefgrube. Locals called it the quarry because the walls swallowed screams and returned only wind. High windows were arrow slits. The courtyard was a pit. Under the keep, the boar yard. No one went near it after dusk. Duke Alaric von Hohenhart ruled from those stones, broad-shouldered, pale-eyed, a streak of white in his beard like frost. He dressed in sable even in summer, claiming he ran cold. People whispered that his heart was buried under the yard, beating in the dirt. He'd inherited a fractured land, toll wars on every road, peasantry starved by failed harvests, merchants robbed on the hill passes by men in his own colors. He called it pruning. Enemies of Hohenhart fed the soil, and the soil fed Hohenhart. The motto, carved above the gate, "What enters, does its duty." 4 names mattered in the beginning. Alaric, the Duke; Lady Sibella of Lothrain, his second wife, a widow with a veil that never left her hair; Brother Conrad, a monk turned steward with hands stained by ledger ink and candle wax; and Jos Brandt, master of the kennels and the boar-yard, a soldier's son who understood noise, how it could terrify, how it could mask the important things. In the valley below, ballads grew teeth. The Duke captured raiders and traders, chained them to posts in the yard, while the sounders, packs of wild boars taken from the Isenwald as piglets and reared in darkness, rutted and raged. The condemned were left alive, tied low so tusks could do their work. Bones cracked in rhythm. The squeals drowned the prayers. Alaric called it justice gone to root. Old law fulfilled by older hunger. Wolves take what they catch. We keep what the wolves cannot. The boars know the scent of wickedness. They do the choosing. But it never began with law. It began with a wedding gift. On the night Alaric married Sibella, the prior of the Silver Abbey presented him with a sealed chest, carved cedar, blackened iron bands, a strange lock ledged like a jaw. It had been found in a peat bog upriver, along with a wooden idol. They burned the idol, not the chest. The chest was too beautiful. Bone inlays made a pattern like braided river paths. Sibella traced it with one finger and flinched with a splinter that bled black. Alaric ordered the lock broken. Inside, among linen wraps, lay a tusk, thick as a man's wrist, curved like a sickle, inscribed in a language Conrad swore was older than the bishop's oldest stone. The tusk stank faintly of myrrh and grave loam. Jos lifted it and turned it in firelight. Shadows bent. The boars in the yard went quiet, as if a hand had pressed over their snouts. They mounted the tusk over the iron door that led down to the yard. Jos joked that it watched them. Conrad did not laugh. Sibella's fingers brushed the charm at her throat. Alaric kissed her cheek and told the guests this was a sign, old power awake and on his side. The first man fed to the yard under the tusk was a robber knight who'd slit 3 pilgrims at the ford. The boars bull-broke him in minutes. The second was a miller who'd shorted the tithe by a quarter sack. The boars hesitated, then they did not. The third was a priest. After that, The valley began to listen for iron bells. It wasn't only that the boars grew braver. The ground changed. Mushrooms erupted in white clusters where blood soaked in, then turned the color of bruised plums overnight. The ivy on the keep thickened like braided rope. Roots snaked around the posts and knotted there. Joss swore he saw eyes in the knotholes. Sibella heard hoofbeats in her sleep. She woke with mud on her heels and broken twigs in the sheets. Brother Conrad counted the days because somebody had to. He scrawled a tally behind the altar. 44 condemned in the first winter. Alaric boasted that theft had dropped, fewer brigands on the road. The duchy's accounts breathed easier. Even the wolves skirted the yard now, their tracks wide to avoid the stain of it. Only the bell ringer refused to set foot near it after nightfall. He was a boy, Tillo, with hair like straw caught in a thatch. He told Sibella the boars sang when the moon went lean. Sang. Sibella took his hand and told him he was dreaming. That same night, a sow gave birth to a litter of 11. Joss held one up to the torch. Between its eyes, under the bristles, lay a pale patch shaped like a crescent. It hissed when he let it go. Alaric began to keep the tusk close to him during judgments. Conrad saw him touching it like a rosary. He worried, but never allowed. In the valley, men had begun to talk about the boar law. If the Duke would take you to the yard, he must first bring the tusk to his lips. If it warmed, you were guilty. If it cooled, your name went on a slate in chalk for prayer. It never cooled by much. Sibella tried to stay gentle, but gentleness thins where fear fattens. She peered at her husband at table and saw how he leaned toward shadows. The white streak in his beard had widened into a slash. He ate little and spoke with a dreamy certainty that made her stomach ice. He said the boars took the worst of them, and that mercy lay in swiftness. He said mercy louder when he had to say it twice. Sometimes he did not sleep. He stood in shirt sleeves on the parapet, listening. When Sibella slid up beside him, his skin felt feverless. Underneath, a stillness like a pond. "They speak," he said once, not looking at her. "They speak of what to cut away." From the yard came a grunt, then another, then a rolling chorus like timber falling. The tusk over the door gleamed wet, as if licked. In spring, a rebellion sparked in the timber camps eastward. A foreman named Ohm tried to hold the line on wages. The Duke sent riders. They brought him back in a cart, wrists twisted with cord. The yard waited. The boars were unrestful as storm water. As Joss chained the foreman to the center post, Ohm said something soft. Joss leaned close. The camera would not hear the words under the noise. Joss flinched. "What was that?" Alaric asked from the stair. Joss hesitated. "He said the ground knows your name." They fed him anyway. The boars came in like a tide.
Rumor does not stop at borders. It makes new ones. By autumn of 1484, a pilgrim appeared on the northern road wearing a patched brown cloak and a crown of rowan twigs. Her name was Agnes of Clots, though the towns called her Candle Mother. She claimed to walk from shrine to shrine, bearing a flame lit from the tomb of St. Clara, and that wherever the flame faltered, a devil had its palm over the wick. She came to the gate and asked for bread and a place by the fire. Sibella had her given both, along with hot wine. Agnes warmed her hands and watched the hearth as if it were a book of hours. Then she said, "You have iron in the wrong places." Brother Conrad stopped breathing for a heartbeat. Agnes lifted her gaze to the corridor that led toward the yard and the hung tusk. "You dug something out of the river that was meant to stay buried," she said, "like a thorn under the nail of the world." Alaric laughed. He called novelty at table, likes the taste for a night. He told Agnes about his justice and his savage critics and his soft-bellied neighbors across the river. Agnes listened, eyes lit glass blue by the fire. "Old boars eat roots," she said when he finished. "They learn what should not be pulled. Men are worse at it." Alaric's face tightened. Sabella saw it. Agnes reached into her heavy cloak and drew out a candle stub wrapped in black cloth. "When I hold this near holy things, it burns brighter. When I hold it near tainted things, it gutters." She stood slowly, so no one would think her magic a trick of speed. She walked toward the corridor. The flame leaned sideways, a flower in wind. When she neared the tusk, it bled tears of wax as if in grief. Then it sputtered, shrank, and smoked foul. Alaric ordered her out before dawn, graciously, publicly pious. Privately, he told Joss to double the watch on the yard door and to hang a charm of hair-tails and bones, a hunter's superstition he would have mocked 2 years before. Brother Conrad pressed his lips to the oak of the chapel door and whispered an apology to a god he'd not been sure of since his second winter. That night, Tilo, the bell-ringer, vanished. They found his cap snagged in the thorns by the orchard wall. Sabella slept with the shutters barred and a knife under the pillow. She dreamed of hooves in the chapel. She woke to hoofprints in the ashpan. In the village, Agnes lit her candle and told them a story, older than the abbey. A story of the white sow of Wormfeld, a mother of monsters that taught the first men to make walls and then made them pay for the privilege. It lay down in a river bend to die, in a place where the river bent like a tusk, and the men made offerings in exchange for luck. They offered sheep, then, once, long ago, they offered a man. They forgot how to stop, Agnes said, and her candle flickered as if a breath had crossed it. When word of her words reached Alaric, he smiled with all his teeth. "Let them be afraid," he told Conrad. "Afraid men pay their taxes. Afraid men stay in their beds." The next storm tore half the roof off the granary. A sow in the yard birthed a litter of 13. 2 were born with extra toes. The one with the crescent mark bit the head off its littermate and swallowed fast, as if someone might take it away. Brother Conrad's ledger had thickened. He kept track of names, times, pleas, even the wind's direction when the bell rang for executions. He wrote in cramped script until his hand cramped. He began adding a symbol no one else saw, a half-circle in the margins beside certain names. Those names had dreams attached to them. He did not mean to know that, but the bad dreams had started after the chest. They tasted like peat water. He woke with a mouthful of rotten leaves. The names with half-circles had the same faces in his sleep. A logger with a notch missing from his ear, the midwife who swallowed hellebore, the mercenary who wore his mother's hair in a ribbon under his shirt, the monk who smuggled apples to children. They came to the yard under the tusk, and the boars took them, and Conrad woke gagging, his teeth clacking as if cold. He told no one. He stopped sleeping in a bed. He tried the chapel floor, then a bench in the library. Every place smelled like the yard. He asked Sabella once whether she had ever heard music beneath other sounds. She said she'd begun hearing a hum under the voices at table, a droning note beneath the prayers. Conrad nodded. "That," he said. At the equinox, a cart came from Weissenmarkt with bolts of linen, barrels of vinegar, sacks of salt. The driver brought a rumor. Bandits calling themselves the Red Hands had taken refuge in Kessel Hollow. Men whose leader wore a boar tooth as a token. Alaric smiled again. "So my justice multiplies," he said, as if satisfied by an arithmetic problem solved. He sent men to fetch them, to feed them in kind. They returned empty-handed and gray-faced, not because the Red Hands had escaped, because the hollow had swallowed them up. Kessel was a sinkhole deep in the Isenwald, lined with black rock, cup-shaped, its floor a sheet of moss and a spring at the center. The soldiers swore they heard rooting overhead while they were underground, sound like something huge walking on leaves. They swore they found tracks at the lip of the hole, split, cloven, too wide for any stag. Joss went to see for himself. He came back quieter, and the scent of the yard clung to him stronger than usual. He told Alaric later in private that the moss down there had been trampled by too many feet to count. Human, bare, all pointed outward, as if men had risen from the spring and walked away. Conrad broke a quill that night and didn't notice until dried ink slicked his palm black as bitumen. He went to the library, sought a manuscript he'd avoided, the Chronicle of Grimbach, Monk's Latin and horrors between glosses. He read by a guttering candle. The Chronicle spoke of an old forest law called the root reckoning. When a lord's justice turned to harvest, the roots would take his feet and lay him down for the worms. It also spoke of a king who wore a boar's head into battle and left his lovers under trees with their throats cut so they'd be found at dawn by pigs. The chronicler had drawn a tusk beside his name as a warning. Conrad took his knife and pried at the tusk over the yard door. It did not move. He tried again while Joss slept off wine in the kennel. He nearly slipped. The iron frame was slick. He brought his candle closer and saw in the grain of the bone hair-fine lines like writing. Not Latin, not anything. He put his ear to it. The hum grew. His guts turned like a lever had been thrown. Sabella found him at dawn, knees muddy, hands bleeding. "You cannot pry up hunger," she said. "You can only starve it or feed it."
Conrad looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. Her veil had slipped. Beneath it, the hair at her temples had gone white as Alaric's streak. "We have been feeding it the wrong meals," he said, and he did not yet understand what he'd said. Winter rolled in like a wagon full of knives. Roads glazed, hearth smoke stayed low, a brown line along the valley. The abbey sent no more letters after Candlemother came. Merchants detoured. The market died early each day, like a son who can't make it to noon. In the keep, meat hung cold in the larder, but the taste went blunt. Wine soured in the cask. Only salt still tasted like itself. Alaric ordered the Feast of Thorns, a midwinter banquet meant to sweeten loyalty after a cruel season. He invited the foresters, the guild masters, the petty knights. He sent riders with vellum and red wax. "Come warm yourselves in my hall," the script read. "Come and be safe." Sabella stood at the balcony and watched the guests arrive. She could tell which ones looked at the yard door and which did not. The ones who looked had shoulders tied up near their ears. The ones who did not took extra bread, as if filling their pockets for a long journey. Joss polished his boots like he was going to a funeral. Conrad burned his ledger pages in a brazier, one by one. He could recite them even as ash rose, a litany of names and dates and the weather when the bell swung. Tillo's name he did not burn. He wrote it again in fresh ink on a scrap and stored it under his tongue like a saint's bone. The hall glittered. Torches in iron brackets, wreaths of holly, a boar's head on the board, ears gilded, apples in its mouth. Music twittered like a trapped bird. Alaric wore a cloak lined with wolf, clasped by a pinned tooth that was not from any known animal. Sabella wore pearls bought with coin from men who avoided the yard by the width of a breath. Halfway through the feast, Alaric rose and spoke of peace, of prudence, of providence. As he did, Agnes of Clots slipped in at the back, hood low. No guard stopped her. One looked at her and looked away, as if his eyes had skipped a stone. She held a candle that dripped black tears, and the wicks burned blue. Alaric saw her and let his smile widen. "Our candle mother returns," he said.
Do you bring us a blessing or a curse? She lifted the candle. I bring you a mirror. He laughed to show he could. Then show me, he said. Agnes tilted the candle. Wax spilled like spilled sealing wax. It traced a curve on the flagstones, 2 curves, a shape like a jaw printed in black. The candle's flame flared and threw shadows long as spears. In the yard below, a sow lifted her snout and snorted hard. The bell outside the hall swung once without a hand upon it. The doors to the yard shuddered. The tusk above the yard door cracked. It sounded like a bone breaking under a horseshoe. Joss jumped to his feet and ran. Conrad ran after him. Sabella moved to follow, and Alaric caught her wrist. Stay, he said, and his grip bit like a metal trap. You'll see what obedience looks like. In the yard, the air unspooled into threads. The sows began to circle. Not a sound of feeding, a sound like chanting with teeth. Joss reached the door. He looked up at the tusk and saw the crack had fresh edges, wet, sticky. He reached to touch, and the hum punched him in the gut. He fell to one knee, retched dry. Conrad grabbed the hammer kept on a spike by the door for driving stakes. Once more, he said to himself. Again. He swung at the tusk where it had cracked. The blow made his arms sing. The tusk sang back, deeper like a church organ's lowest pipe. Again, again, splinters flew. A sliver stuck in his cheek like a translucent thorn. Blood leaked thin and blackish down his jaw. Above, in the hall, Agnes watched Sabella. There was a look between them, recognition. Not old friends, old rivals for the same kind of pain. Sabella jerked her arm free from Alaric's grip. If you cannot tell the difference between a blade and a kindness, you should not hold either. The guests had risen, some to run, some to pray, one to vomit. The boar's head on the board started to steam, not the meat, the skull. Fat sizzled in patterns like letters. Conrad's hammer bit the tusk. With a sound like a sapling snapping, it fell. It hit the yard stones and did not shatter. It rolled. It lay there and hummed, a tooth dreaming in gutter water. Joss bent to lift it, intending to throw it down the well or into the fire, or anywhere it would stop making his bones feel like flutes. As his fingers touched it, his mind filled with a winter morning with his father, a spear glinting, a boar breaking cover and rushing them, foam in its mouth, blood at its flank, power like a river that does not care for you. He yanked his hand back, blistered. It wants a carrier, it wants a mouth. Then don't give it yours, Conrad said, voice thin. In the hall above, the black wax that traced the jawline smoked. The smoke pooled on the ceiling. It gathered into shape, not pig, not man, something between, long, low, massive. It had too many legs for a breath. Alaric stared at it as one might stare at a phantom alliance on a map. He drew a knife. My will is iron, he said, as if the words could be hammered into the air. Sabella had moved to the doorway. She raised her voice. Joss, she called down the stair, throw the tooth to the sows. Joss froze. Conrad turned to her, looking startled in a way that made him look younger. What? He asked. You would feed them the thumb that presses them down? Sabella's eyes were glass and rain. If it belongs anywhere, it belongs in their mouths, not ours. Joss lifted the tusk with his cloak wrapped around his hands. He threw. It landed between the sows like a priest's mistake. Silence. Then the crescent-marked sow stepped forward. Slowly, every bristle trembled under torchlight. It sniffed the tusk. It opened its mouth and took the end of the bone between its teeth like a mother taking a babe's hand. It bit. Blood hissed out where no blood should be. The tusk screamed, not a sound boars make, a sound like wind turned sharp and forced into a reed. In the hall above, the black wax that traced the jawlines shivered and broke into trails. The candle's blue flame burned clear. Alaric lowered the knife. Agnes exhaled, and the wick popped. Down in the yard,
The sows lifted their heads and inhaled, long and slow. Then they turned their gaze as one toward the stair, toward the hall, toward Alaric. It began with a skitter of pebbles on the stair and ended with a crown of mud.
Alaric heard them before he saw them, hooves on stone, breath like bellows. He backed away only a step. "This is my house," he said. Conrad grabbed his arm. Jos put himself between Sabella and the stairs. Agnes murmured words that sounded like a nursery song turned sour. The first sow appeared in the doorway, nostrils flaring, eyes black and bright. The crescent-marked leader followed, slow as nightfall. They did not charge. They entered like noblewomen at court, owning every eye. They smelled the boar's head on the board and did not turn. They smelled Alaric and did not waver. The room held its breath. Sabella stepped aside. It was not surrender, it was witness. Alaric's jaw clenched. The white in his beard glowed under torchlight. He raised his knife again, faithful as a dog to the wrong thing. "If I feed you, do you leave me be?" he asked quietly. No one answered. The crescent-marked sow stopped 3 paces from him. She stamped once, twice. The flagstones trembled. Something shifted under the hall. Agnes's candle flame pointed toward the far wall where the keep's original foundation lay. Conrad felt the draft under his feet and thought of cellars beneath cellars, of burial under building. A noise started in the deep, roots tearing, stone cracking, a smell like old riverbed, like teeth kept too long in a pouch. Sabella grabbed a torch and thrust it at the floor. Smoke rose from the cracks, not as from wood, but as from a wet thing beginning to breathe. The floor buckled, the board flipped, apples rolled. The boar's head slid to the edge and fell, jaw clacking the whole way down. In the hole that opened, black water swam. Not much, an inch, then 2. Enough to show ripples when breath moved. Out of the water came a crown. Not gold, a ring of carved oak, black with tannin, studded with tusk points. It rose as if lifted by a slow hand. Then a skull followed at its pace. Long snout, broad brows, human eyes, empty. It rose to the lip of the hole, an artifact, wearing itself. The sows bowed their heads, a tremble in their haunches as if pinned by a weight. Agnes whispered, "Unearthed king." Alaric saw his face reflected in the black mirror of the water, then in the gleam of the tusk crown. He saw himself old and thin and wanting. He took 1 step forward. Conrad reached for him and missed cloth. Sabella said his name once, and it sounded like a vow and a goodbye. Alaric set his knife down. He walked to the lip of the hole. The floor creaked under his boot. "If this is the law," he said, quiet, almost relieved, "I serve it." He leaned. The crown tilted toward him. The room narrowed to a pin. Jos moved, sudden, but the crescent sow shouldered him back so gently that he slipped and did not fall. Agnes's candle burned white. Conrad whispered a prayer he'd never learned. Alaric fell like a man lying down to sleep. The water closed over the crown, then his face. The ripples stilled in an instant. The room did not exhale. It wouldn't. It couldn't. The sows stood and waited, ears pricked, as if for a note at the end of a song. Something breathed below. Once. Twice. Then nothing. The water was only water again, with a film of oil like old soup. The boars turned and left the hall in an orderly line. No panic, no flurry. They descended the stair and returned to the yard. The crescent-marked sow paused at the door. She looked back, eye to eye with Sabella. Then she went down into the dark and was gone. Agnes's candle guttered and failed. She pinched the wick with her fingers and did not wince. Conrad sank to his knees and laughed once, a broken plate of a sound. Joss leaned his forehead against the doorframe and cried and did not make a sound doing it. Sabella stood in the wreckage and set the torch on the edge of the hole and watched the flame's reflection smear on oiled water. The bell outside swung slow, without hands, one time for a death, then again for a sovereign, then a third time for something no bell had words for. The duchy went quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not peace, aftershocks. People spoke softly for days. Men removed their hats when passing the keep road and did not know why. The abbey sent a verger to take stock. He left at noon and never arrived at dusk. Sabella took the seat at the head of the table, but did not move her things into Alaric's chamber. She ordered the yard emptied of its living occupants and filled with clean straw. She sent Joss with a purse to pay the families of men who'd gone through the gate and come back in barrels. She did not stand on the parapet after dark. She stood in the chapel instead, facing the door as if expecting a visitor. The tusk above the yard door was gone. In its place, a patch of stone that wept on cloudy days. Brother Conrad became the duchy's quiet mouth. He called in debts and forgave most of them. He took down the motto above the gate and hung nothing in its place. He ripped the half-circles out of his ledger until the spine broke. He cooked porridge for the kitchen girls with his own hands, and burned it twice and ate it anyway, and smiled with black teeth.
Agnes left without goodbyes. That was her way. The village said she walked the river bend and laid down the candle where the water hooked. Some said the candle went out forever. Others swore they saw a blue flame under water on nights when no wind blew, and heard a sow calling her piglets and answered, and then the moon turned the color of tallow. Joss returned from his rounds slower. He'd paid 33 families before his purse ran light. He began to sleep in the kennels with the hounds because their breathing made him feel like a boy again in a house where the only sounds were familiar and fair. He woke one night with the sense that someone was sitting near him. He turned his head. The crescent-marked sow stood just inside the doorway. She had no mud on her flanks. Her eyes were not animals' eyes and not man's. They were made for seeing in a kind of dark men do not know. She walked to him, slow. She pressed her snout to his forehead gently. Her breath smelled of roots and pennies. She exhaled once. Then she left, and the hay did not stir where she'd stepped, as if she was the idea of weight, not the thing. Joss wept again. He had never been God-struck before. He had always thought he was too old for it. He was wrong. Sabella ordered the hole in the hall bricked and covered with a hearthstone so heavy that even 5 men grunting together could not shift it. The mason, a man named Eber, mortared the edges with salt instead of sand. He said he'd learned it from rivermen who sealed their boats with salted pitch to keep the rot spirit out. He drew a sign in the wet mortar, a tusk broken in 2. The mortar hissed when his finger traced the curve. Brother Conrad found Alaric's knife where it had fallen. The blade was clean. He carried it out to the orchard and drove it into the root of the oldest tree. He said, "Det in, det out." The wind changed direction and smelled like winter bread. The boars stayed in the yard. They ate their mash and rolled in straw and slept in a tangled heap. They grew fat. They birthed fewer litters. The crescent-marked sow stood often by the gate and looked up into the keep windows, the way a dog watches a door waiting for one certain set of footsteps. 3 nights after the bricking, Tylo rang the bell. No hand on the rope.
The bell sang at midnight. Sibella, Conrad, and Jos all woke in the same second, hearts like fists. They went to the chapel. The door stood open. The ledger lay on the floor, pages spread like fallen birds. On the altar sat a cap made of straw, not Tylos, not from any head. The bell rang again, then ceased. Conrad knelt, and his knees hurt as if he'd walked long, hard miles. He pressed his palm to the flagstone and felt it answer him with a faint push back. He whispered thanks, without knowing to whom. The duchy learned a different fear, not of a man's whims, of what men awaken when they confuse their hungers with the law. Sibella ruled without spectacle. The yard stayed open by day for the boars to roam, and closed by night with iron. No one went in with a rope around their wrists any more. When an enemy came, she held a court with witnesses. She wrote sentences in ink instead of blood. Sometimes she still sentenced men to die. When she did, the scaffold creaked, and the bell tolled, and the ground kept its silence like a held tongue. Travelers who passed deep in the Eisenwald told strange stories. They saw a woman walking with a candle that did not smoke. They heard humming where no sound should carry, and felt it in their molars. A woodcutter laid his ear to the earth at Kesseln Hollow and heard a heartbeat slow as sleep. He swore he heard a voice old as tree sap say, "Not yet." He did not return to hear it say now. Brother Conrad grew thinner. He wrote new ledgers. None of them had half circles. He kept a list of names of those spared by Sibella and read it to himself on cold nights, a liturgy of reprieve. He visited the hole under the hearthstone in the hall by sitting on the edge of the new hearth and warming his hands until his skin went red. He imagined heat traveling down to where crowns dream. He didn't know if it did. Jos trained a new generation of keepers. He taught them how to listen to the yard at night without imagining shapes in the dark. He taught them how to imagine the correct shapes. He grew gray at the temples and smiled less and better. The crescent-marked sow visited him less often, then not at all. He knew without proof that she'd gone to ground in a place where the river bends just so. He poured ale into the water twice a year and said nothing aloud. Sibella bore no children. People wondered what the duchy would do in a generation. She answered with treaties, with irrigation, with bread. She spoke in parables only when sleep took her words and left them with too few teeth. Agnes of Clotes was seen once more, years later, on the steps of the abbey that had kept so quiet. She lit a candle on a cold night and held it up to a relic. The candle burned blue, then steady white. She said, "Some devils are patience, some saints are hunger. The world is not as careful as we want it to be." Then she blew the flame out and walked on. The tusk stays missing. Some say it dissolved in the sow's mouth and turned to milk. Others say it walked in a man's pocket down to the river and sleeps amid reeds, waiting for a hand to fish it up. Conrad's chronicle of Grimbach gained a new gloss in his careful hand. A king set his crown in the well and sank after it. The forest took his voice and gave it to pigs. When men grew quiet, the pigs learned to speak. Then the monk drew a half circle beside his own words and scraped it out until the parchment thinned. If you listen at the quarry on a windless night, you might still hear rooting far below the hearthstone, like a prayer spoken into a fur collar. You might hear the bell toll thrice without hands. You might hear a boy's laugh braided with a grunt, a sound that means nothing in any court, and everything in a field where blood feeds weeds. What remains? A keep with a hearth that warms better than any before it, a yard that smells of straw instead of rage, a valley that walks soft around a certain bend in the river, a name no one speaks at table, though the holes that name left behind still drink the rain. Legacy is like that. It isn't what lies in a line on a page, it's what hums under the line when the candle gutters and shadows thicken. It's what you set above a door, and what you pry down, and what you feed to mouths that never learned gentleness, and then somehow did.
What did Tilo hear before he went into the fog? Who wears the tusk if it rises again? Did Alaric kneel at last, crown pressing his brow, lover to a law older than words? Or did the ground swallow only a man and leave the hunger untouched? The moral? Power mistakes appetite for justice when winter is long and pride is hungry. Fear becomes ritual, and ritual becomes architecture, and architecture cages breath. Obsession builds doors, but forgets to build exits. If you must feed your enemies to something, ensure it is not the part of you that recognizes your own reflection. Because the teeth of the world are patient, they will learn your name, and the forest will remember.